Hi there, this video is going to talk about finishing up your bead crochet bag. This is after you've crocheted the whole thing, and it's just a few steps to make it look nice. So it includes sewing down this top edge and adding some boning and adding a handle and lining as well. So the first step to finishing the bag is to sew down the top edge and add boning to help keep the structure. Before we start sewing, we need to cut a length of boning and shape it to fit the top of the bag. We'll be using heat to create the proper shape in the boning, and I prefer to use a heat gun, but you can also try using boiling water or a lighter. I would recommend making sure you're in a well-ventilated area, especially if you're using a lighter to shape your boning. You just might get some weird plastic fumes going on, so open a window or go outside or just make sure it's well-ventilated. I start by holding my boning up to the bag and cutting off a section that's at least a few inches oversized. Next, I'll create the first bend approximately 1/3 of the way into the boning. If you just bend the boning with your hand, it'll spring back almost all the way, so this is where the heat comes in. If you gently heat the boning while creating the bend, you get a better shape that's more permanent. After creating the first bend, I hold my boning against the bag to figure out approximately where to create the second bend. Make sure to straighten out the boning really well so you get an accurate measurement. Once you measure out where the second bend should be, go back to heating up the boning in that spot to create the second curve. With both curves in place, you'll want to test the fit. You may need to trim off some extra boning if it gets in the way. If it seems to fit well, you can go back to your heat source and straighten out the sides of your boning and finish up any shaping you want to do. If it's too big or small, you can also reshape it to a better size. With the boning properly sized and shaped, we're ready to connect the two ends together. I like to put it back in the bag one more time to figure out exactly where the two ends of the boning should overlap. Make sure the boning sits tightly against the inside of the bag at all spots, but doesn't push out so far that it stretches out the bag. You can use a Sharpie to mark where it should overlap, or just keep a tight hold of it with your hands. We'll use the heat one more time to seal the ends together. For me, a lighter is the best way to melt the plastic so it sticks together, but again, it's probably a good idea to have good ventilation for this step. I just heat the plastic till it looks a little bit transparent, and then you can tell that it's kind of melted, and then I press it together. It might discolor a little bit, and that's what mine did, but you shouldn't see it in the final product, so you don't have to worry about that too much. If you want, you can experiment with other methods of holding the two ends together in the right spot, but this is what has given me the best luck without falling apart or weakening over time. After I have it connected together, I try to trim it up as close as I can to the seam. The more bulk you can remove from it, the easier it'll be to actually sew it into the bag later on, so I just try to trim it and shape it a little bit smaller and thinner than it is. Once you're done trimming this overlap, you're ready to start sewing. I start by knotting a good length of string into the very top part of the bag. It'll be like the very first row you did that doesn't even have any beads, just kind of plain crochet. And I like to secure it into one of the sides of the bag rather than one of the corners. The corners are just really hard to start and end with because it's such a tight space and it's a little bit extra tricky to work in. So I'd recommend starting on one of the sides. Once you have your string secured to your bag, you can put your boning into place just at the very top of your bag. I like to line up the very top of the boning with the top of the first row of beads. With the boning in place, we're going to be sewing down the very top edge of the bag around the boning to kind of create a pocket, and we're going to be going all the way around the bag, sewing the boning into it. I zigzag back and forth between the non-beaded very edge of the bag and about 3 rows down into the beaded section of the bag, and I just kind of go back and forth between these two sides, and it creates this little like pocket that the boning sits in, and I just go all the way around the bag. You'll want to keep things pretty tight as you go, and I especially noticed that my non-beaded section that's kind of on the inside of the bag at this point gets stretched out and looks a little bit more holy just because I'm sewing so tightly and kind of keeping things nice and secure as I go. You'll also want to make sure that you don't cover any of the strap holes as you're sewing down the rim. It can be easy to let the boning slide a little bit lower and just cover them up. So keeping it nice and tight and snug will help stop from covering up those holes because you'll need them exposed later on when we add the straps in. Try to sew into the holes of the stitches rather than sewing through the thread itself as you go. This can weaken the string and break it, which would be a tragedy if you broke your bag at this point, so do your best to sew through the holes instead. Once you sew all the way around and reach where you started, you'll tie a knot and weave the string in a little ways away before trimming it. If your pattern has a bead crochet handle, we'll talk about that step next. If it doesn't, you can just skip this part and move on to the next piece. I have the pattern for one of my handles pulled up, and the process is actually super similar to doing the body of a bag or crocheting a bead crochet bracelet. If you've ever tried that, you'll start by stringing up your beads, and then you can see at the top it says how many stitches around it is. You'll start by chaining that number and connecting the end to the beginning, just like you would in the body of the bag. And then you'll want to single crochet a few rows without beads. You want it to be about an inch long, so it might be 10 to 20 rows. Once you get about an inch in, you can start crocheting with the beads, just one bead per stitch like normal, and you'll go all the way through the pattern until you reach the very end, and you'll end off by doing an inch of crocheting without beads. I normally make repeating patterns for my crochet handles, which means if you want it to be a little bit longer, you can finish the pattern all the way through and then just go back to the beginning and string up your beads again and crochet more, and you could lengthen it a little bit longer. Once you've finished crocheting the whole handle and you have that extra inch on either side that has no beads, you're ready to attach it into the bag. This process isn't too complicated. You'll line up the non-beaded section on the inside corner of the bag so that from the outside you can only see the beaded portion of the handle. And then you can sew over the non-beaded section, kind of zigzagging back and forth a couple times to secure it into the bag. Just make sure that you sew back and forth on each side enough times that it can hold whatever you're going to put in your bag eventually. With that done, we're ready to move on. The next step is lining the bag, which is definitely optional. I have a lot of bags without lining, and they haven't really shown signs of damage so far, but this could be a good way of adding just a little more protection, and it can also help the bag look a little more finished. We're going to start by creating a super basic pouch, and then we'll sew it into the bag after we've sewed it all together. We'll start by cutting out a piece of fabric that is a couple inches wider than your bag and then a couple inches taller than twice the height of it. Once you fold it in half, it should cover the whole bag and have a little extra fabric to spare on each side. After cutting the fabric, fold it in half with the right side of the fabric together and sew up one of the sides. With the first side sewn, place the fabric inside the purse to measure out where the second side should be. Mark the location of the second seam and sew it. After sewing, you may need to trim any excess fabric. With the sides sewn up, we need to determine how tall the pouch should be. I do this by putting it back in the bag and pushing it as far in as I can. Once it's all the way in, I'll mark where the very top row of beads ends, and I'll fold the fabric pouch on that line. I fold the top of the pouch outwards so that it will be hidden between the lining and the inside of the purse. If you have a lot of excess fabric at the top, you may want to trim it before you fold it over. It can be helpful to iron or steam the folded edge just to keep a nice crisp line, especially when you're sewing. It'll help you keep a straight line. Once I've finished folding it over and preparing it, I'll put it back into the bag and just pin it into place. Now we're ready to sew it into the actual bag, and I'm doing my very best to stay at the tippy top of the pouch and right on the edge of the beads. My goal is to hide any of the plain crocheted section that is covering the boning, and so if you just kind of sew very small stitches at the very top of the pouch and right next to the beads, it should kind of hide most of that. Once I get all the way back to where I started sewing, I'm going to just secure a little knot, and then I'll thread my string under, in between the layers, and sew a little ways away before trimming my string. If you're adding a store-bought handle, you'll need to carefully cut a small hole into the lining that lines up with the hole in the crocheted part of the bag. The hole is so small that I don't really do anything to clean it up, but you could experiment if you wanted it to look nicer. I like to use a small pair of scissors to cut this hole because I have better control over it and I'm less likely to cut into my crocheted portion of the bag. Once you have this hole cut, you can just clip your handles on and your bag is done. Please let me know if you need help with any part of the finishing process. The best place to reach out is through Etsy. I can see your messages really quickly and just help you one-on-one. And also let me know if you have any ideas or anything else you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching.